I wasn't the kind of woman who did things like this. At least, that's what I told myself as I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the neckline of my emerald green dress. It was a dress I hadn't worn in years, one that hugged my curves in a way that made me feel alive again. My reflection stared back at me, a 34-year-old woman with tired eyes and a restless heart. I smoothed my hair, took a deep breath, and grabbed my coat. The charity gala was being held at the historic Riverside Hall, a grand venue overlooking the Hudson River. My husband, Daniel, had declined the invitation, citing a busy week at his architecture firm. "You go," he'd said, kissing my forehead absent-mindedly. "You deserve a night out." I'd nodded, but deep down, I wondered if he even noticed how distant we'd become. We were like two ships passing in the night, sharing a home but not a life. The gala was everything you'd expect: crystal chandeliers, live jazz, and the clinking of champagne glasses. I mingled with colleagues from the non-profit I worked for, forcing smiles and small talk. But my mind was elsewhere. That's when I saw him. Ethan. He was standing near the bar, his dark suit tailored to perfection, his tie slightly loosened as if he didn't care about the formality of the event. At 38, he carried himself with a confidence that was both magnetic and intimidating. Ethan was the keynote speaker for the evening, a renowned journalist who'd spent years covering war zones and humanitarian crises. I'd read his articles, watched his interviews, and admired his work from afar. But seeing him in person was something else entirely. Our eyes met across the room, and for a moment, the noise of the gala faded into the background. He smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made my stomach flip. I quickly looked away, but the damage was done. My heart was racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. I spent the next hour avoiding him, busying myself with conversations I barely remembered. But Ethan was persistent. He found me near the silent auction table, his presence immediately commanding my attention. "You're Claire, right?" he asked, his voice smooth and low. "From the non-profit?" I nodded, surprised he knew my name. "Yes." "And you're Ethan. I'm a big fan of your work." He grinned, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Well, that makes two of us. I've heard great things about what you're doing here." We talked for what felt like minutes but was probably closer to an hour. His words were intoxicating, his stories captivating. He had a way of making me feel seen, something I hadn't felt in a long time. When he asked me to dance, I hesitated. The music was slow, sultry, and dangerous. But I said yes. The moment his hand rested on the small of my back, I felt a spark. It was electric, undeniable. We moved to the music, his body close to mine, his touch searing through the fabric of my dress. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt so alive. "You're incredible," he murmured, his breath warm against my ear. "I've been wanting to talk to you all night." I laughed nervously, trying to ignore the way my heart was pounding. "You're not so bad yourself." As the song ended, he didn't let go. Instead, he leaned in closer, his lips brushing against my ear. "Let's get some air." I nodded, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. He led me out onto the terrace, the cool October air a sharp contrast to the heat building between us. The city lights sparkled in the distance, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he turned to face me, his eyes locking onto mine. "I don't usually do this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But there's something about you." I should have stopped him. I should have walked away. But I didn't. Instead, I let myself get lost in the moment as his lips met mine. The kiss was intense, his hands tangling in my hair as he pulled me closer. I felt myself giving in, the rational part of my mind screaming at me to stop, but the rest of me didn't care. When we finally pulled apart, I was breathless. "Ethan," I started, but he silenced me with another kiss. "Don't overthink it," he said, his voice rough with desire. "Just be here with me." For a moment, I considered it. But then the image of Daniel flashed in my mind, his kind eyes, his quiet strength, the life we'd built together. I stepped back, my heart aching with guilt. "I can't," I whispered, tears welling up in my eyes. "I'm married." Ethan studied me, his expression unreadable. "I know," he said finally. "But that doesn't change how I feel about you." I shook my head, the weight of my actions crashing down on me. "This was a mistake. I'm sorry." He didn't try to stop me as I turned and walked away. The ride home was a blur, my mind spinning with what had just happened. When I walked through the door, Daniel was asleep on the couch, a book resting on his chest. I knelt beside him, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though he couldn't hear me. The days that followed were a blur of guilt and self-reflection. I avoided Ethan's calls and texts, determined to put the night behind me. But the memory of his touch, his kiss, lingered like a shadow. One evening, as Daniel and I sat on the porch watching the sunset, I finally found the courage to speak. "Daniel, I need to tell you something." He turned to me, his brow furrowed in concern. "What is it?" I took a deep breath, my hands trembling. "At the gala, I kissed someone. It was a mistake, and I regret it more than anything." The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel stared at me, his expression a mix of hurt and disbelief. "Why?" he asked finally, his voice breaking. "I don't know," I admitted, tears streaming down my face. "I was lost, and I made a terrible choice. But I love you, and I want to make this right." He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he reached for my hand, his grip firm but gentle. "We'll figure it out," he said quietly. "But it's going to take time." I nodded, the weight of my guilt still heavy on my chest. But for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. Temptation had led me to the edge, but love, real, imperfect love, had brought me back. But I still think of Ethan sometime. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of love, betrayal, and redemption. Life is messy, but it's in the mess that we often find our truth.